Elena Voss, 53 years old, an African-American woman with warm, deep brown skin, her naturally curly hair tied back neatly, a few silver strands showing at her temples, stood before the board of the very company she had spent 25 years of her life building. And in that moment, she realized her name had vanished from everything she had kept running. There was no warning, no argument, just her access being revoked right before her eyes as the internal monitor switched to a locked state, as if the system had just decided she never belonged. She was still wearing her familiar white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up neatly, just like any other morning, her old metal watch resting on her wrist. Nothing had changed on the outside, except for the way the entire room avoided her gaze. The man at the end of the table flapped lightly through a file, his voice as calm as if he were confirming a transaction that had been settled long ago. "We appreciate your contribution, but legally, you no longer own anything here." No one reacted. No one needed to react, because to them, everything had been signed, transferred, and locked down by laws and numbers they believed were irreversible. Elena didn't answer right away. She stood still long enough for the silence in the room to grow heavy. Her gaze wasn't angry, not panicked, but held a kind of calm that made the people facing her unsure whether they had just concluded a matter or just started a mistake. She looked up, her voice low and clear. "Are you absolutely sure I have nothing left?" A few people shifted in their seats, not because they doubted the outcome, but because they never thought she would ask that question. To them, the answer was already obvious. Every account was in Marcus Hale's name. Every asset had been restructured. All control had left her hands before she even walked into this room. But Elena wasn't looking at them when she asked that. She was testing something else. She glanced around the room one last time, as if memorizing exactly who had chosen to remain silent in this moment. Then she turned and walked out without another word, her pace steady, not faster, not slower. As if this were just a normal morning that had ended a little earlier than expected. 6 days before she stood in that conference room, Elena Voss's morning began the way it had for more than 20 years, with almost no variation. She would wake up at 5:30, before the city was fully lit, the small kitchen still cold, and the first thing she did wasn't check her phone, but turn on her computer. The laptop opened on the kitchen table, its blue light reflecting off her deep brown skin. Her curly hair was tied back neatly, a few silver strands visible at her temples, but they didn't make her look weaker. They only made her look like someone who had seen too much to react to things that didn't matter. She poured coffee into her usual mug, the one with a small chip on the rim. She never replaced it, never fixed it, much like how she kept everything in a state of stable operation rather than making it look perfect. 5:37 a.m. The system began processing its first transactions of the day. Elena didn't look at the overview dashboard like most of the tech team. She went straight to the logs, long, dry lines of data, no colors, no charts, just the truth, recorded second by second. She read them the way other people read the morning news. No one asked her to do this so early. No report ever noted it. But Elena had always believed that if you want to understand a system, you have to look at it before anyone else has touched it, when everything is still honest. She remembered every time the system had nearly crashed. Not the major incidents the whole company knew about, but the tiny moments that only she noticed. One winter morning 8 years ago, a cash flow routing algorithm began to drift slightly between two intermediary accounts. The deviation was small enough that it didn't trigger any alerts. The dashboard was still green, the metrics were fine. No one paid attention, except Elena. She saw a line of data repeat 3 times with an illogical interval, and she knew immediately what would happen if it continued. Not right away, but it was enough to create a chain reaction that would be too late to stop by the time anyone else noticed. She paused the entire processing flow for 9 minutes. No one asked why. No one knew what she had prevented. The system just kept running as if there had never been a problem, and that story never appeared in any meeting. That was how Elena existed in that company. She wasn't the person named on the slides, not the one who talked to investors, not the one who stood in front of the cameras. She was the one who kept everything from falling apart. Marcus Hale was the complete opposite. Marcus would walk into a boardroom with the confidence of someone who knew he represented the entire company. He talked about growth, expansion, about numbers that had been polished to tell the story others wanted to hear. He was the CEO, the name on every document, every account, every major decision. And for a very long time, Elena never questioned it. Not because she didn't understand her own value, but because she believed they were building the same thing, just from 2 different positions. Marcus built what everyone saw. Elena built what kept it all from collapsing. There were evenings she'd stay late at the office after everyone else had gone home, with only a single row of lights on in the tech area. She would open up the system layer by layer, checking points no one else even remembered, not because there was an alert, but because she didn't believe in waiting for an alert to act. She didn't call it overtime, she called it responsibility. And it was precisely that mindset that made her miss what was happening in parallel. While she was keeping the system stable, other things were being changed, not in the code, but on paper. Marcus had started restructuring accounts, transferring ownership, and rerouting cash flows through legal layers that Elena never directly touched. Sometimes he would give her papers to sign. She would ask a simple question or two. "What's this?" Marcus would answer briefly. "Tax optimization." She signed. It wasn't that she was careless, but because in her mind at the time, those things weren't the most important part of what they were building. She believed in the system. But the system she believed in wasn't the legal system. It was the operational system. And for 25 years, those 2 systems existed in parallel without ever colliding. One system kept everything running. The other system transferred everything into someone else's name. No one at the company truly understood just how deeply Elena understood the system. They knew she was good. They knew to call her when there was a problem. They knew she would fix it. But they didn't understand that most of what they were using was just a surface layer, built on a foundation that only Elena could see in its entirety. A foundation not written to be impressive. A foundation written so that no one would ever have to notice it. And that was also why, when things changed, little by little, Elena didn't react immediately. It wasn't because she didn't see it. It was because she was used to believing that if something was truly dangerous, the system would let her know. But this time the system kept running. It just wasn't running for her anymore. And that didn't appear in any of the logs she checked every morning. Until the day she stood in that conference room and realized, for the first time in 25 years, she had been watching the wrong system. There wasn't a single moment when everything fell apart, not one big decision that made Elena lose it all. Instead, it was a series of tiny changes over 2 years, slow enough not to attract attention, logical enough not to raise suspicion, and precise enough that by the time she looked back, there was nothing left to reclaim. The documents Marcus gave her always arrived at times when she was least likely to ask questions. After a long day, between 2 meetings, or right before she had to handle what she considered a more important technical issue. They never looked dangerous. They were presented neatly, concisely, with titles that anyone could understand in the simplest way. Account restructuring, tax optimization, cash flow adjustment, ownership update. Words that sounded like a natural part of a growing company. And for a very long time, Elena saw them exactly the way Marcus wanted her to, as minor details. Once, she paused longer than usual, not because she was suspicious, but because a line in a document didn't align with her understanding of how the system operated. She looked up from the dinner table, where the two of them sat opposite each other just as they had for years, and asked a simple question. Why is this account being restructured? Marcus didn't look up right away. He cut a piece of his food, set his fork down, and only then did he answer, his voice even and without a hint of hesitation. Tax optimization. No further explanation, no details. There was no need, because over the course of 25 years, he had built something more important than any explanation: trust. Elena looked at the document for another few seconds, not because she didn't understand, but because she was conditioned to believe that if Marcus said something about an area she didn't directly control, it was being handled correctly. She signed. It wasn't because she was careless. It was because, in her mind, the things that truly mattered were always somewhere else, in the lines of code, in the systems she could see, test, and fix. But these things, the words on a page, they didn't belong to the world she knew how to control. That process repeated itself. Not every day, not constantly, but just infrequently enough to never become a noticeable habit, and just regularly enough to slowly transfer everything away from her. An account in Marcus's name instead of both of theirs. An investment moved into a legal structure she wasn't directly a part of. An access right adjusted to fit a new role that was never clearly explained to her. None of it was big enough to raise an alarm. But altogether, they created a result she only saw when it was far too late. Elena wasn't the type to miss details. She only overlooked the details she believed didn't affect the core. And that was precisely what Marcus understood best about her. He didn't need to hide everything. He just needed to make sure that the most important things were outside the areas Elena felt she needed to control. During those 2 years, the company's systems ran perfectly, even better than before. No major incidents, no anomalies in the sections Elena monitored every morning. Everything reinforced the belief that what they were doing was right. And it was that very stability that kept Elena from ever stopping to ask the more important question. Not, what is this? But, why am I not the one in control of it? After the divorce, once everything was signed and transferred, when she had walked away from the life she once thought was hers, there was one person who stayed in regular contact with her. Adrian Hale, 29 years old, her adopted son, the one Elena had once believed understood her better than anyone else in that family. He called every week, not always on time, but often enough to create the feeling that he was still there, that he still cared. He would ask very normal questions. Are you okay, Mom? How's the new place? Do you need any help with anything? And then, so naturally, as if it were just part of the conversation, he started asking about other things. Are the company's old systems still active? Did you keep any of the data? Any backups that other people don't know about? Elena answered. Not because she didn't notice. The questions were more specific than usual, but because she never had a reason to doubt him. Adrian never pushed, never pressed. He always stopped at just the right moment, changed the subject, leaving the impression that his questions were just idle curiosity. And that's how the smallest pieces of information were taken from her. Not by force, but by familiarity. Elena didn't realize it right away. It wasn't because she wasn't perceptive enough. It was because she was still viewing things from a perspective where family was the last place you needed to be on your guard. Until one small detail didn't add up. A question Adrian repeated in a slightly different way. A pause that was just a little longer than usual after she answered. A very faint feeling, not enough to be called suspicion, but enough to make her replay all their previous conversations in her mind. And for the first time, Elena didn't just hear what was being said. She heard what was being left out. And when she pieced it all together, not with emotion, but in the same way she always did with data, she understood something simple. Not everyone who was still talking to her was on her side. Some people don't betray you in a loud way. They just choose the side that benefits them more. And during all that time, Adrian hadn't lied to her. He just didn't tell her who he was repeating it to. No one stopped her, because as far as they were concerned, she had already lost everything that mattered a long time ago. 6 days later, Elena sat alone in a data storage room that no longer appeared on any of the company's official system maps, a place built in the early days when everything was small and no one thought it would ever be replaced. That door had no name, no new security layer. No one had checked on it in years because no one even remembered it existed, except for the person who built it. She pulled up a chair, placed her hands on the old keyboard. The screen flickered to life, slow but steady, just as it always had, unassuming, unremarkable, simply existing. Her fingers paused for a second before hitting a key, not out of hesitation, but because she understood very clearly that if what she suspected was true, then everything that happened in that conference room 6 days ago didn't mean what they thought it meant. Then she opened the file, a file with no special name, not marked as important, buried deep within a system considered obsolete. But inside it was something no contract could erase, no signature could transfer, and no system they controlled could ever touch. They had revoked her access to everything they could see. But they forgot one simple thing. Some things don't belong to the company. And they never had. There was no single moment when Elena realized she had lost everything, not in the way people imagine. There was no crash, no phone call with bad news, no event big enough to name. It was just a series of very small things that began to stop working the way they always had. The first day, she stopped at the grocery store like she always did, picked up a few essentials, stood in line, not in a hurry, not thinking about anything, until she handed over her card and the machine made a short beep. The cashier looked at the screen, then at her, with that familiar look of someone who doesn't know what to say. Declined. Elena didn't react right away. She tried it a second time, same result. It wasn't a system error, not a connection issue. The account just didn't belong to her in the way she'd always thought. She paid with cash, no questions, no explanations. It was just a small detail in an ordinary day she didn't yet know was about to change. The second day, she opened her laptop in the morning as usual, typed in her company email password. Reason paused for a few seconds, then displayed a message she had never seen before. Access denied. No instructions, no recovery options. Just a line of text confirming that the system she had logged into thousands of times no longer recognized her. She tried again, slower, more precisely. Nothing changed. She didn't call anyone. Not because she didn't know who to call, but because a part of her was already beginning to understand what was happening. The third day, she drove to the office, parked in her usual spot, walked into the lobby, gave a reflex nod to the receptionist, and held her key card up to the scanner at the glass door. No click. Just a small red light, blinking steadily, as if the system was just doing its job. The security guard looked at her, not with annoyance or tension, just with mild confusion. "Ma'am, your access has been updated. I can't let you in." Elena nodded. She didn't ask any more questions, didn't try to explain. She stood there for a few more seconds, as if checking to see if she'd missed anything, then turned and walked out. No one told her to leave. No one needed to. She no longer belonged there in the way the system understood it. In the days that followed, small details continued to disappear. A bank account no longer showed its familiar balance. An updated ownership notice. A call from a lawyer confirming what had been signed. A little bit of everything. Nothing big enough to be a shock, but enough that when pieced together, there was nothing left. Elena didn't sit down and burst into tears. She didn't break anything. She didn't call Marcus to ask why. It wasn't because she felt nothing. It was because she was starting to see everything the way she had always seen a system. It wasn't a question of whether it had collapsed, but where it had been changed. She sat in her car one afternoon, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, not to find an immediate answer, but to organize everything that had happened in her mind. Everything still existed. The company was still running. The account still had money. The office was still open. The system was still running. It just no longer belonged to her. And in that moment, Elena understood something that no notification could ever properly convey. It didn't collapse. It was removed. It didn't collapse. It was removed. That statement held no emotion, no anger, no regret. Just the most accurate description of what had happened. And once she named it for what it was, she also knew what she had to do next. Not to get back what was lost, but to find the part that had never been taken. Elena didn't go back to that room, hoping to find something left behind. She went back because she knew that if there was one place that hadn't been touched, it would be the one place no one would think to check. She didn't have to guess. She remembered. An internal backup system, created in the early days when the company was small, when things weren't complex enough to need new layers of security, and not yet important enough for anyone to think about deleting the old stuff. Elena had written it, not as an official product, not for reports, not in any presentation. It was just a redundant layer so she could check things when she needed to, without affecting the live system. It hadn't been updated to the new standards. No nice interface, no smart alerts, just raw data recorded in the most honest way possible. And because it wasn't useful by the current company's standards, no one had touched it for years. Elena opened that system like she was reopening a part of her memory, something she had once built with her own hands and then left behind. She wasn't searching randomly. She knew exactly where she needed to look. Not at her own accounts, not at what had been taken from her, but at the flow of the money. The cash flow analysis algorithm she had written wasn't designed to detect fraud. It was designed to understand how the system moved resources in its normal state. And that's precisely why it was so dangerous when something abnormal occurred. Elena ran that algorithm again on the old data. Not the new data, she no longer had access, but the data that had been recorded over all those years prior. The system didn't ask her if she had permission. It just did exactly what it was written to do. Lines of data began to appear. Not quickly, not beautifully, but clearly. And Elena didn't read them like someone looking for evidence. She read them like someone looking for a rule. At first, they were just small movements. A sum of money passing through an intermediary account before disappearing from the chain the main system was tracking. A repeating structure between different legal entities that all shared the same organizational method. An overlap in timing between account restructuring and asset transfers. On its own, none of it was enough to be conclusive. But Elena wasn't looking at them individually. She pieced them together, layer by layer, chain by chain, pattern by pattern, just like she had always done when there was a problem with the system. And then something began to emerge, not a bug, but a design. She paused for a second, not out of surprise, but to verify that she was seeing exactly what she thought she was seeing. She opened the historical logs again. 7 years of data. Unedited, uncleaned, not rewritten the way modern systems often are for optimization. Just the truth, recorded in step by step, and in those 7 years the same structure appeared multiple times. Not just with her accounts, not just within the last 2 years, but repeating long before that with different names, different entities, but the very same logic. Elena didn't need any more data to understand. Marcus hadn't done this to her. Marcus had been doing this for a long time, and she wasn't the only one. What made Elena pause wasn't the fact that everything had been taken from her. It was that the way it happened was identical to what she was seeing in the data of others. Flawless. Not a single crack. There were no signs of coincidence. Just a system built well enough to make every small step look like a reasonable decision. Elena sat motionless before the screen, not needing to move, not needing to open another file. She had seen enough, and what she had just seen wasn't a single act of wrongdoing. It was a pattern, a method, another system built in parallel to the one she had spent 25 years protecting, except this time she wasn't the one who built it, and she wasn't the one being protected from it. Elena didn't stand up the moment she realized she'd stumbled upon something far bigger than what had happened to her. She didn't make a call, didn't print any documents, didn't try to react immediately. She did what she always did when a system began to reveal an anomaly. She remained seated and read, not reading to find evidence strong enough to fight back, but reading to understand how it worked, because Elena knew if she misunderstood, any action that followed would only cost her what little she had left. The lines of data continued to appear, unchanging, offering no explanation, simply recording what had happened. A name appeared, then vanished from the chain of ownership after a series of valid transactions. An account was transferred to a new legal entity that had been established only a few months prior. A structure that repeated with near-perfect precision across different cases. Elena didn't need to know who those people were. She didn't need to know how much they had lost. She only needed to see how it happened. And the way it happened to her was no different from the way it happened to them. No sign of coercion. No overtly illegal transactions. Nothing that a standard monitoring system would flag. Only signatures. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Minor adjustments that, if viewed in isolation, gave no one a reason to stop and probe further. Elena scrolled down more slowly. She started looking not at individual transactions, but at the entire structure. Shell companies, created with lifespans just long enough to establish credibility. Intermediary accounts that never held money for long, but always appeared at just the right moment. Changes in ownership executed in a way that never broke the law, but always led to the same result. The assets left their original owner and never returned. No errors, no obvious trail. Just a system designed to look like a series of rational choices. Elena's hand froze over the keyboard, not because she didn't know what to do next, but because she had just put a name to what she was seeing. This wasn't a divorce. This wasn't an asset dispute. This wasn't a paperwork error. This was an extraction system, a system that doesn't take your money by force, but one that makes you transfer it away yourself. Elena leaned back in her chair, her eyes still on the screen, but she was no longer reading line by line. She was looking at the entire picture, and for the first time in years, she realized the most dangerous part wasn't what had been taken. It was in how it was taken. There's no pressure great enough for you to resist. No clear signs to make you suspicious. There isn't a single moment you can point to and say, "That's when I lost it all." Just a series of decisions that at the time you believed were the right ones. And by the time you realize it, everything is already beyond your grasp. Elena didn't feel the kind of anger most people would upon realizing they'd been deceived. She felt something else: clarity. Because once you see the system, it's no longer personal. Marcus wasn't the only one. Marcus was just the operator of something built well enough to be replicated. And that made Elena understand a deeper layer of the problem. The most dangerous person isn't the one who takes your money. It's the one who makes you sign it away yourself. Not because you're weak, but because they understand exactly what you believe in. And they build the entire system around that belief. Elena sat still in the old room, with no one there to hear what she had just realized, no one to share it with, no one to react. But she didn't need to, because in that moment, she was no longer the woman who had just lost everything. She was the only one inside this system who understood how it truly operated. And that was more important than anything that had been taken away. Elena didn't leave the room right away, but when she stood up, she knew her next step wasn't within the system itself, but in how that system was understood and used. And the first person she thought of wasn't an ally, but someone who could tell her what she held was real. And what could make her lose everything all over again. The lawyer's office was on a quiet street. No large sign, no pretense. It was simply the kind of place people who understand risk go when they no longer want to guess. Elena placed the data on the table. No lengthy explanation. She knew what was inside was clear enough for someone who knew how to read it. The lawyer didn't speak right away. She read each part, slowly, precisely, not skipping any detail, and it was that slowness that made Elena realize this wasn't a conversation she could control with speed. A long silence passed before she finally looked up. "If you use this wrong, you lose everything again." There was no emotion in her voice, no warning, no threat, just a statement of fact. Elena didn't respond immediately. It wasn't because she didn't understand, but because she was reprocessing everything that single sentence implied. This data wasn't part of any official system. It hadn't been collected through standard legal procedure. There was no explicit consent from those involved. It was the truth. But not all truths can be used safely. The lawyer continued, her tone just as level. "If you push this too early, they will turn it against you. They will question how you got it, not what it shows. And if that happens, you don't just lose the case. You lose credibility." Elena gave a slight nod. No strong reaction, no argument, but her eyes changed. It was no longer the look of someone who had just made a discovery, but of someone who understood that what she held was dangerous in both directions. Not just to them, but to her. She left the office with no concrete plan, no immediate next step. Only one thing was clearer than before: she couldn't rush this. And right at that moment, Adrian called. His name lit up the phone screen, familiar, routine, just like the weeks before, as if nothing had changed. Elena stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Adrian's voice was the same as always. No tension, no difference. "Are you okay, Mom? How have you been these past few days? Has anyone been helping you out yet?" Then, so naturally, as if it were just part of the conversation. "Do you still have any data from the old system? Are any of the old servers still running?" "Does anyone else know about that stuff?" Elena answered, but not in the way she used to. Slower, shorter, enough to keep the conversation going, but not enough to give anything extra away. She ended the call as usual, without changing her tone, without creating any obvious distance. But this time, when she put the phone down, She didn't move on to something else. She opened her call history. Not the call that had just ended, but the ones before it. She selected one from 2 weeks ago and played it back. Adrian's voice came through, familiar, gentle, nothing suspicious if you only heard it once. But Elena wasn't listening like a mother. She was listening the way she reads data. Each question was asked at just the right moment. Each pause was just long enough to let her fill the silence herself. Each change of subject came right after he'd gotten enough information. She rewound a section and listened a second time, not because she couldn't hear it clearly, but because she was checking the pattern. The questions never started directly. They always came after a caring remark. They always ended before getting too specific. No pressure, no sign of information gathering. Just a conversation. If you didn't know you were being interrogated. Elena paused on a short segment where Adrian asked about a backup system she'd almost forgotten existed until he mentioned it. She remembered how she had answered back then, so naturally, so completely, holding nothing back. Because back then she had no reason to. She turned off the recording and set her phone down. There was no strong reaction, no anger, no sadness. Just a different kind of clarity settling in. Not everyone who was still talking to her was on her side, and the greatest danger didn't come from her opponents. It came from the people who stood close enough that you never thought you had to keep your guard up. Elena didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't call back to confront anyone. She didn't cut off contact. She just changed the way she listened. And in the calls that followed, she no longer answered the way she used to. It wasn't because she wanted to hide anything. It was because she understood now. In a system where information is the greatest currency, every answer is also a transaction. And this time, she was done signing things without reading them. Elena didn't call Adrian the moment she realized what was happening. She didn't react on instinct or seek a confrontation over the phone, because she understood that some questions should only be asked when you can see the answer on the other person's face. She chose to meet in person, a small coffee shop on a corner. Not too crowded, quiet enough that they wouldn't have to raise their voices, and ordinary enough that no one would notice a conversation that could change a relationship forever. Adrian arrived a few minutes early, just as he always had as a boy. He sat at a corner table, leaning slightly forward, a hand resting on his untouched glass of water. His eyes were on the door, as if waiting for something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Elena walked in and saw him immediately. No hesitation, no pause. She just pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. No hug, no long greeting, just a slight nod. Adrian spoke first, his voice falling into its familiar rhythm, asking the questions he always asked. "Are you okay, Mom? How's the new place? Need any help with anything?" Elena listened to it all. She didn't interrupt or react, showing nothing but the calm demeanor he was so used to. When Adrian paused, waiting for her to answer like always, Elena didn't answer any of his questions. She looked directly at him. Not for long, but long enough for him to realize this conversation wasn't like the others. Her voice was low. Not heavy, not rushed. How long? Just 2 words. No explanation, no elaboration, without pointing to anything specific. But Adrian understood. He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew that any answer would be a confirmation. A long silence stretched between them. There wasn't much noise around, just the soft clinking of glasses being set down somewhere behind them, enough to amplify the stillness that had fallen between them. Adrian looked down for a second, then looked up. His gaze didn't avoid hers, but it no longer held the same natural ease as before. He didn't say, "It's not like that." He didn't say, "I did nothing wrong." He didn't say anything to deny it, and for Elena, that was enough. She nodded very slightly, as if some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment. Her voice remained steady, not higher, not trembling, not carrying any judgment. "You didn't betray me." She paused for a beat, not for effect, but to ensure every word was heard clearly. "You chose what was useful." Adrian didn't react immediately. He didn't argue, didn't try to explain, because he knew it was true. Not in the way he had thought about it when he did those things, but true in the way Elena had just named it. There was no villain in that moment. No one was playing the victim, just two people sitting across from each other, seeing the same truth from two different angles. Elena didn't ask any more questions. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't need a detailed explanation. Because what she needed to know was in his eyes, and in the way he chose not to deny it. She stood up, not in a hurry, not creating a dramatic end to their meeting. It was just a simple movement, like the way she had left the conference room 6 days earlier. Adrian didn't stop her, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood that once some things are given their proper name, there's no way to go back to how they were before. Elena walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, not because she wanted to appear strong, but because she no longer had a reason to. For 25 years, she had been accustomed to keeping things running, fixing errors before they became problems, believing that if she just did her job well enough, the things that mattered would be preserved. But in that moment, she understood something much simpler. Not everything needs to be saved. Some things, once you see them clearly, letting them go is no longer a loss. Elena didn't go home and immediately call a lawyer to file a suit. She didn't write long emails, prepare for a public confrontation, or try to win back what was lost in the way people usually think about justice. She did the opposite. She stopped, not out of fear, but because she understood that what she held in her hands wasn't a story that needed to be told. It was a system that needed to be put in its proper place. In the days that followed, Elena practically vanished from sight. She didn't show up at the office, didn't contact former colleagues, and didn't answer the calls she knew would lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer. She wasn't avoiding it. She was just choosing her moment. The data she had wasn't something you could just throw into an argument and expect it to prove itself. It needed a place where it would be read the right way by people who didn't care about her personal story, but only about how the system operated. Elena didn't send it all at once. She broke it into pieces. It wasn't about hiding. It was about making sure each piece was understood before the next one appeared. The first files she sent didn't bear her name, contained no lengthy explanation, just data, clearly organized, enough for the recipient to realize this wasn't an ice case. A week passed. No response. 2 weeks. A request for additional information appeared. Not direct, not official, just a small signal that someone had started looking at what she sent. Elena didn't rush to reply. She read the request over and over, not to understand the question, but to understand the person asking it. Then she sent more, in the same way as before. No emotion, no unnecessary explanation, just what was essential. She wasn't trying to prove she was right. She was just ensuring that the system could no longer operate without being seen. Time moved slowly in a way only those accustomed to working with data would understand. There was no explosive moment, no single day when everything clearly changed. Just small movements beginning to appear where before there had been complete silence. An account came under review. A transaction was put on hold. A legal structure was questioned. Elena didn't track all of this constantly. She didn't need to. She knew that once the right people looked in the right place, the system would expose itself. What mattered wasn't how much evidence she had. It was where she placed it. And when. She never made an appearance. Her name wasn't on any of the documents that were sent. No statements, no stories told from her perspective. If anyone tried to look, they would only find the data. Not the sender, not the motive, just a system being scrutinized from the inside. Marcus received no warning from her. No calls, no threats, no sign of what was coming. And that was precisely what made things begin to shift in a way he couldn't control. Elena wasn't trying to tear everything down. She just stopped holding it up. For 25 years, she had been the one who quietly ensured everything ran smoothly, fixing deviations before they became problems, keeping the system stable enough that no one ever questioned it. This time, she just didn't do it anymore. She didn't sabotage anything. She simply stopped fixing things. And in a system built to look perfect from the outside, you only had to stop fixing the smallest deviations, for everything to reveal itself. No loud noise was needed. No one needed to step forward to claim responsibility. All it took was time, and a system that was used to not being seen was now beginning to be seen properly. Elena didn't have to be there to witness it. She had done her part. The rest belonged to the very system they believed no one could touch. The changes didn't start with a big shock, but with very small things. Small enough that if you weren't paying attention, you'd think everything was still normal. But for a system accustomed to running smoothly for years, just one small snag was enough to set off a chain reaction that no one could fully control. At first, it was calls that Marcus didn't get an immediate answer to like before, a partner delaying a signing, a transaction put on hold for further review, very reasonable excuses, if taken individually. But when they repeated, they created a friction that even those accustomed to risk began to notice. An account was asked for a more detailed explanation. A legal structure had its validity questioned. A series of wire transfers no longer went through as easily as before. There were no public announcements. No one stood up and said something was wrong. It was just the system beginning to look at itself. Marcus didn't see it right away, not in the first week. He still went to meetings, still gave presentations, still talked about expansion plans as if everything was on track. But the people sitting across from him started asking different questions. Not about growth, but about structure. Not about the future, but about the past. Marcus answered the way he always did. Confidently, articulately, without revealing any hint of doubt. But those questions didn't disappear after the meeting ended. They followed him out of the room, into private conversations, into emails he wasn't copied on, into discussions he couldn't control. Then one day an official notice appeared. It wasn't loud, nothing sensational. Just a document requesting a temporary halt of some operations for an investigation. Marcus read it twice, not because he didn't understand the content, but because he was trying to find an angle, a way to maneuver, just like the times before. But this time, there was no room to maneuver. Because the problem wasn't with a single transaction. It was in the very way the entire system was designed. What had once been his advantages, the complexity, the legality, the obscurity, now became the very things that made a simple explanation impossible. Partners began to pull back, not because they knew exactly what was wrong, but because they were no longer sure what was right. In an industry where trust is built on predictability, the moment you lose that, everything else falls on its own. A company doesn't collapse in a day. It slowly loses the things that hold it up, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to hold. Licenses were put under review. Contracts were suspended. People who once stood close began to create distance. Marcus was no longer the person people wanted to be seen, with once things started coming under scrutiny. And in all of it, there wasn't a single moment he could point to and say, "This is when it all ended." There was only a chain of consequences that his own system had set in motion. Adrian's name wasn't brought up at first. He still came to the office, still held his position, still tried to keep everything normal. As if no one said it out loud, it wouldn't be real. But data doesn't work that way. His name started appearing in documents where before there was only a signature. Now, it was part of a chain of connections, not the one in control, but a participant. And in a systems under scrutiny, that line isn't nearly as clear as it once was. An internal meeting was held that he wasn't invited to. An access level was restricted. A formal request for a statement was sent directly to him. Adrian read it in silence. No one was there with him, no one to ask what he should do. He understood enough to know that these were no longer questions he could dodge by saying less or changing the subject. His name was there. And once it was there, it didn't disappear just because he wanted it to. No one got revenge on them. There was no one actively pulling them down. No one had to. What happened was simply a result of the way things had been built. A system sophisticated enough to take things away without leaving an obvious trail. Was also a system complex enough that, when looked at again, couldn't defend itself with simple explanations. Marcus didn't lose the company in a single moment. He lost it in every decision he had once believed was safe. Adrian didn't lose his position because of a single mistake. He lost it because he was part of a system he thought he understood, but was, in fact, only using. And the clearest thing in all of this was that none of it required a direct confrontation. No shouting, no grand statements, just consequences, arriving right on time, and in the exact place they were always waiting to be found. Elena didn't go back to the company. She didn't try to get her position back. She didn't show up to tell her story. She didn't try to reframe what had happened, the way people usually do when they finally get a chance to speak. She left it all exactly where it belonged and chose a path no one expected of her. She started over with something much smaller than what she was used to. No big team, no sprawling office. Just a simple workspace and a system she built from the ground up, in a way she'd never had the chance to before. It wasn't built for growth. It was built for clarity. Elena didn't build the same kind of company. She built a platform that helped people see what they were actually signing, not in complex legal language, but by translating everything back to its essence, where the money flows from and where it goes. At what point ownership changes hands? Who really controls what you think is yours? The kinds of things that before only someone inside the system could see. Her time was now set aside for people who never thought they'd need to understand. No big advertisements, no media campaigns. Just people who came to her after hearing from someone else that there was a place you could go to understand exactly what was being done with your finances before it was too late. Elena wasn't trying to prove she was right. She was just helping others avoid making the same mistake. One afternoon, as light streamed through her office window, a woman sat across from her. Not young, not too old, her face carrying the weariness of someone who had been through something they didn't fully understand. She didn't ask about the system, didn't ask about the data. She just looked at Elena for a moment and then asked, "How did you survive that?" The question wasn't born of curiosity, it was a search. Elena didn't answer right away, not because she needed to think, but because she knew the answer wasn't in retelling what had happened. She placed her hands on the table, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her laptop. Her gaze, holding a stillness, left the other person unsure whether to feel reassured or concerned. I stopped signing things I didn't understand. She paused for a brief beat, not for effect, but to ensure the next part was heard clearly, including people. The other woman said nothing more. There was no need to ask again, because that answer didn't just apply to paperwork. It applied to how we trust, how we grant authority, how we let others stand in the most important parts of our lives without truly understanding what they're doing with that position. Elena didn't look away. She let the silence hang between them as part of the answer. There was no advice, no lesson spelled out, just a truth that the person opposite her could choose to understand in her own way. And in that moment, Elena was no longer the one who had lost everything. She was the one who understood what was truly worth keeping. Evening came slowly. The light in Elena's office wasn't the harsh glare of the workplaces she once knew, just a soft glow, enough to make the screen in front of her clear. There were no urgent notifications, no back-to-back meetings, no one waiting for her to confirm something immediately. She sat straight-backed at her computer, hands resting lightly on the keyboard, but not typing yet. Not because she didn't know what to do next, but because for the first time in years, she didn't have to react to anything. The system in front of her was still running, but not in the old way. No more complex layers built to hide what others didn't want seen. No more pathways that only a select few knew how to read. Just clear lines of data moving in the right direction, with no guesswork required. Elena watched them for a moment, not to check for errors, but simply to observe. She was no longer looking for a problem before it happened. She was no longer propping up something that wasn't built to last. She just let it run, and if something needed to be changed, she would change it, not to maintain an image, but to maintain the truth. Outside the window, the city carried on. The buildings were lit, the roads never stopped, and other systems continued to operate in ways most people would never see. Elena wasn't in those systems anymore. It wasn't because she couldn't go back. It was because she didn't need to. She hit a key, opened a new file, no preset title, no template, just a blank space. She began to type, line by line, not fast, not slow, unburdened by time or the expectations of anyone else. The metal watch on her wrist was still there, scratched as before, but this time it wasn't measuring endless work hours. It was simply passing. There was no one standing behind her, looking at her screen. There was no one she needed to prove anything to. There was no system she had to keep perfect. There was only what she understood, and how she chose to build it. The screen cast a soft glow on her face, not tense, not defensive, just a calm that didn't need to be maintained. And in that quiet, there was nothing left to take back, because nothing was being taken from her anymore. If you've followed this story this far, you might not just be thinking about Elena. You might be thinking about yourself, about the things you once believed were safe, the decisions you signed without pausing long enough to understand, the people you placed your trust in without ever checking what they were doing with that position. Not all loss comes from one big moment. Most of it comes from the very small things, repeated long enough, until you no longer recognize what you've lost. Elena didn't get back what was lost. She just stopped letting other people decide for her what was important. And sometimes, that's the only way to start over without carrying the same ending with you. If this story made you pause for a moment and look at what you're holding on to, or what's quietly slipping away from you that you haven't yet put a name to, share it with someone who you think needs to hear this. And if you want to continue with stories that are not just for listening, but for better understanding how things really work behind what we see, subscribe to the channel. We'll see each other in the next story.